Welcome to a journey through the history of the Chicago Bulls, one of professional basketball's most storied franchises, a team whose legacy has touched generations of fans and whose impact on the sport extends far beyond the city limits of Chicago. Tonight, we'll explore the Bulls' story from the very beginning, from their founding in the mid-1960s to their transformation into a global phenomenon. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the story of the Bulls ease you into peaceful rest. Our story begins not with championships or superstars, not with packed arenas or worldwide recognition, but with a simple announcement on a cold January day in 1966. On January 16th of that year, the National Basketball Association awarded Chicago its third professional basketball franchise, bringing the sport back to a city that had experienced professional basketball before but that had never quite found sustained success with it. Chicago had been home to the Stags in the late 1940s, a team that had competed in the Basketball Association of America before that league merged with the National Basketball League to form the NBA. And more recently, the city had hosted the Packers, who later became the Zephyrs before relocating to Baltimore. Neither franchise had lasted, neither had captured the city's imagination in lasting ways, and by 1966, Chicago had been without professional basketball for several years. But the NBA was expanding in the mid-1960s, growing beyond its traditional East Coast roots and looking to establish franchises in major American cities that could support professional basketball. Chicago, with its millions of residents and its passionate sports culture, was an obvious choice for expansion. The city had proven it could support professional sports, the Bears in football, the Cubs and White Sox in baseball, the Blackhawks in hockey, and the league believed that basketball could thrive there as well if the franchise was built properly and if the right people were involved in its creation. The man who would bring professional basketball back to Chicago was Dick Klein, a former professional player who had competed in the NBA and who understood the game from a player's perspective in ways that most team owners never could. Klein became the founder of the Chicago Bulls, and in doing so, he established a unique distinction that has persisted throughout the franchise's history. He remains the only owner the Bulls have ever had who actually played professional basketball himself. His playing career gave him credibility with players and coaches, gave him insights into what made teams successful, and gave him the understanding necessary to build an expansion franchise from nothing into something competitive. Klein understood that expansion teams faced enormous challenges, that starting from scratch meant competing against established franchises that had been drafting and developing players for years, that had chemistry and continuity and all the advantages that come with being established organizations. The expansion draft process, where new teams selected players that existing teams made available, was typically designed to protect the established franchises, allowing them to keep their best players while only exposing the marginal talents and aging veterans they were willing to part with. Expansion teams usually ended up with rosters full of players that other teams didn't want, creating situations where new franchises struggled for years before they could accumulate enough talent through the regular draft to become competitive. But Dick Klein was determined that his Chicago Bulls wouldn't suffer that fate, that they wouldn't spend years as a league doormat before gradually building toward respectability. He lobbied the NBA intensely before the expansion draft, arguing that the rules should be changed to give expansion teams a better chance to compete immediately, that allowing established teams to protect too many players would doom new franchises to years of futility. His specific proposal was that teams should only be allowed to protect 7 players from their rosters, rather than the larger numbers that had been permitted in previous expansion drafts. 7 protected players meant that established teams would have to expose some genuine talent, some players who could actually contribute and help expansion teams be competitive, rather than just filling roster spots. Klein's lobbying was successful. The league agreed to the 7-player protection rule for the 1966 expansion draft, a change that would prove crucial to the Bulls' ability to build a competitive roster from the start. When the expansion draft took place, Chicago was able to select 18 players from the rosters of the existing NBA teams, and because those teams could only protect 7 players each, some of the talent available was genuinely useful, players who could play rotation minutes and contribute to winning basketball, rather than just collecting paychecks while the team lost. Among the players the Bulls selected in that expansion draft were several who would become important to the franchise's early years. Bob Boozer was a veteran forward who had been a quality player for several seasons, someone who could score and rebound and who brought professionalism and experience to a roster that would be full of players adjusting to new teammates and new systems. Johnny Kerr was a center who would not only play for the Bulls but who would also become the franchise's first head coach, leading the team on the court while also helping to guide them through the challenges of being an expansion franchise finding its identity. Len Chappell was another forward who brought size and scoring ability, who could contribute immediately, and who gave the Bulls some versatility in their front court. The roster that Klein and the Bulls assembled through the expansion draft wasn't going to challenge for championships. Expansion teams never do in their first seasons, but it was respectable, it was competitive. It gave Chicago a foundation to build on rather than a collection of players who were just happy to be in the NBA. The 7-player protection rule that Klein had fought for had worked, had given the Bulls a stronger starting point than most expansion franchises received, and it would prove crucial to the team's ability to establish itself in Chicago and to begin building toward the success that would come in later decades. From that January announcement awarding Chicago a franchise to Dick Klein's unique status as a former player turned owner, from his successful lobbying to change the expansion draft rules to the selection of 18 players including Boozer, Kerr, and Chappell, the foundation of the Chicago Bulls was being laid in 1966. The pieces coming together that would eventually support one of the most successful franchises in professional sports history. The journey was just beginning. The challenges of building an expansion team awaited, but Chicago had its Bulls, and professional basketball had returned to the Windy City. The foundation had been laid through the expansion draft. The roster assembled with 18 players who could compete at the NBA level, and now the Chicago Bulls needed someone to lead them, someone to coach this collection of veterans and role players and turn them into an actual team, rather than just a group of individuals wearing the same uniform. The decision of who would be the franchise's first head coach was crucial, would set the tone for the organization's culture, would determine whether the Bulls could exceed expectations or whether they would struggle like most expansion teams do in their early years. Dick Klein made a choice that was both practical and symbolic, hiring Johnny Red Kerr as the Bulls' first head coach. Kerr was a Chicago native, someone who had grown up in the city and who understood what Chicago sports fans expected, what they valued, how they thought about their teams. His local roots gave him immediate credibility with the fan base, made him someone the city could embrace as one of their own rather than an outsider trying to build something in unfamiliar territory. But Kerr wasn't just a symbolic choice based on geography. He was also one of the players the Bulls had selected in the expansion draft, a veteran center who knew the game intimately, who had played at the highest levels for years, and who could relate to his players because he was one of them. The decision to have Kerr serve as both player and coach was unusual but not unheard of in the 1960s NBA, when rosters were smaller, and when teams sometimes asked their veterans to take on dual roles that would be impossible in the modern game. Kerr would be on the court playing center, battling in the post and grabbing rebounds, and then during timeouts and halftimes he would be coaching, making strategic decisions and managing rotations and trying to put his teammates in positions to succeed. The dual role was demanding, requiring energy and focus that few people could sustain, but Kerr was committed to making it work, committed to helping the Bulls succeed both as a player and as their leader. The Bulls' very first game was scheduled for October 15, 1966, a road contest against the St. Louis Hawks, an established franchise with quality players and home court advantage. The Hawks were expected to win comfortably. Expansion teams in their first games are supposed to lose, are supposed to be overmatched by the veterans and the cohesion that established teams have built over seasons together. The first game is usually about just competing respectably, about not being embarrassed, about showing that the expansion team belongs in the league, even if they're not ready to beat quality opponents yet. But the Bulls had other ideas. On that October evening in St. Louis, Chicago played with energy and confidence that surprised everyone watching, executing their offense, defending with intensity, competing on every possession like a team that had been playing together for years rather than just a few weeks. Bob Boozer scored effectively. The role players hit shots, and Johnny Kerr managed the game brilliantly despite the challenge of playing and coaching simultaneously. When the final buzzer sounded, the scoreboard showed something almost unbelievable. Chicago 104, St. Louis 97. The Bulls had won, had upset an established team on the road in their very first game, had announced to the league that they weren't going to be an easy victory for anyone. The victory in that first game was more than just a feel-good story. It was a statement, a sign that the Bulls were going to be different from typical expansion teams, that the competitive roster Dick Klein had assembled through the expansion draft rules he'd fought for was actually going to translate to success on the court. Chicago fans who had watched the Stags fold and the Packers relocate, who had been disappointed by professional basketball before, could allow themselves to hope that maybe this time would be different, that maybe the Bulls would actually stick around and give the city something to be proud of. The success wasn't just limited to that opening night victory. The Bulls continued to compete throughout the 1966-67 season, winning games they weren't supposed to win, staying in close contests against better teams, playing with a cohesion and a toughness that belied their status as an expansion franchise. They weren't dominant. Expansion teams never are, but they were respectable, they were competitive, and they were accumulating victories at a rate that seemed almost impossible for a first-year team. As the season progressed, as the wins kept coming, it became clear that Chicago was doing something special, something that expansion teams simply didn't do. When the regular season ended, the Bulls had posted a 33-48 record, winning 33 games against 48 losses. A losing record, certainly, more losses than wins, the kind of record that in most seasons wouldn't be particularly noteworthy. But for an expansion team in its first year of existence, 33 wins was remarkable, unprecedented, the best record ever posted by an expansion franchise at that time. The previous expansion teams had struggled to win even 20 games in their inaugural seasons, had been overwhelmed by the talent gap between themselves and established teams, had taken years to build toward respectability. The Bulls had achieved respectability immediately, in year one, surpassing all expectations and all historical precedents for first-year franchises. But the Bulls weren't done making history. That 33-48 record was good enough to earn Chicago a playoff berth in its inaugural season, something that seemed almost impossible, something that expansion teams simply didn't do. Making the playoffs required not just being respectable but being better than several established teams, finishing high enough in the standings to earn one of the postseason spots that were so fiercely competed for. The Bulls had done exactly that, had outperformed multiple veteran teams, had earned their place in the playoffs through their play rather than through sympathy or special consideration. The playoff appearance in year one established the Bulls as a franchise that could compete, that could build on success rather than starting from rock bottom and spending years climbing toward mediocrity. And the success wasn't just a one-year fluke. Through their first 5 years of existence, the Bulls reached the postseason 3 times, an unusual feat for a new franchise, a demonstration of sustained competitiveness that most expansion teams couldn't match. Where other expansion franchises spent their early years losing, rebuilding, hoping to eventually become competitive, the Bulls were actually winning, actually making playoffs, actually establishing themselves as a legitimate NBA franchise rather than just filling a roster spot in the league. The early success of the Bulls' first season, that remarkable 33-48 record and the playoff appearance that had exceeded all expectations, created optimism and excitement throughout Chicago. Fans who had been burned by previous professional basketball failures in the city allowed themselves to believe that this time would be different, that the Bulls would be a permanent fixture in Chicago's sports landscape, that the team would continue building on its promising start and would eventually compete for championships. The inaugural season had drawn respectable crowds, people curious to see this new team and pleasantly surprised by how competitive they were, how entertaining the games could be even when the Bulls didn't always win. But as the late 1960s progressed, as the initial novelty of having a new professional basketball team wore off, attendance began to decline in ways that concerned the franchise's leadership. The Bulls were still competitive, still making occasional playoff appearances, still fielding teams that could beat quality opponents on any given night. But competitive wasn't the same as championship caliber, and Chicago sports fans had high standards, had been spoiled by the Bears and the Cubs and the White Sox, and they weren't going to fill arenas consistently just to watch a team that was merely respectable. The early attendance numbers that had been encouraging started to drop, empty seats becoming more visible, the atmosphere in the arena becoming less electric and more subdued. The challenge facing the Bulls wasn't on the court. They were winning enough games to remain relevant, to justify their existence as a franchise. The challenge was in the stands, in getting people excited about coming to games, in creating an experience that was compelling enough to draw fans even when the team wasn't challenging for championships. Professional basketball in the late 1960s was still finding its identity, still competing with baseball and football for fans' attention and entertainment dollars, and teams needed to do more than just play games. They needed to create events, experiences that would make people want to come to the arena even when the outcome of the game itself was uncertain. In 1969, the Bulls brought in Pat Williams as their general manager, hiring a promoter who understood that professional sports was about more than just what happened on the court, that creating a successful franchise meant engaging fans in ways that traditional basketball operations didn't address. Williams was creative and energetic, constantly thinking about ways to make Bulls games more entertaining, more memorable, more worth attending even for casual fans who might not know every player's name or understand every strategic nuance of the game. He understood that you needed to give people reasons beyond just the basketball to come to the arena, that entertainment and promotion were as important as talent evaluation and coaching in building a successful franchise. Williams introduced numerous innovations designed to energize fans and create buzz around the team, promotions, and entertainment elements that would make Bulls games events rather than just basketball contests. Some of these ideas were gimmicks that didn't last, experiments that seemed silly even at the time, but Williams understood that you had to try things, had to take creative risks, had to be willing to look foolish occasionally if it meant finding something that really resonated with fans and that could become part of the franchise's identity. One of Williams' ideas would prove to be far more than a temporary gimmick, would become one of the most lasting and beloved aspects of the Chicago Bulls franchise, would influence professional sports across multiple leagues and multiple decades. In the 1969-70 season, Williams introduced Benny the Bull, a costumed mascot who would entertain fans during timeouts and breaks in the action, who would interact with the crowd in ways that added energy and fun to the game experience. Mascots existed in sports, certainly. College teams had them, some professional teams had them. But they were typically passive figures, characters who waved from the sidelines or stood in designated areas posing for photos. Benny the Bull was different from the start. This wasn't a passive mascot content to stand around and wave. Benny was interactive, engaging with fans throughout the arena, performing stunts and skits, creating moments that had nothing to do with the basketball game but that added entertainment value, and that gave fans something to watch and enjoy during the natural breaks in action. Benny would run through the stands, would interact with opposing players in humorous ways, would create comedy routines that made people laugh and that made coming to Bulls games feel like more than just watching basketball. But Williams understood that gimmicks and mascots and promotions could only do so much, that ultimately the product on the court had to be compelling, that the team needed to win and to play an exciting style that would keep fans engaged even when Benny wasn't performing. In 1968, Williams made another crucial hire, bringing in Dick Motta as head coach to replace Johnny Kerr and to reshape the team's identity in ways that would make the Bulls more competitive and more respected throughout the league. Motta brought a hard-nosed, defensive-minded coaching style that was very different from what the Bulls had experienced under Kerr. Where the early Bulls teams had been scrappy and competitive but lacking a clear identity, Motta's teams would be tough, physical, defensively oriented squads that would grind out victories through effort and execution rather than through offensive firepower or individual brilliance. Motta demanded discipline and accountability, installed defensive systems that emphasized helping and rotating, and created a culture where playing hard and defending were valued as much as scoring points. The change in style and emphasis would take time to fully implement, would require roster changes and player development, and the gradual building of a team that fit Motta's vision. But the foundation was being laid, the identity being established that would carry the Bulls through the 1970s, and that would make them one of the NBA's more respected franchises even before they found the superstar talent that would eventually deliver championships. From the attendance challenges of the late 1960s to Pat Williams' creative solutions and promotional innovations, from the introduction of Benny the Bull as an interactive mascot to Dick Motta's arrival and his hard-nosed coaching philosophy, the Bulls were searching for stability and identity, finding ways to engage fans while building a competitive team that could sustain success over the long term. The early 1970s brought a transformation to the Chicago Bulls, a shift in identity and culture that would define the franchise for an entire decade, and that would earn them respect throughout the NBA, even if championships remained elusive. Dick Motta's hard-nosed coaching philosophy was taking root, his emphasis on defense and toughness and relentless effort creating a team that might not have had the most talent in the league but that would never be outworked, that would never surrender, that would make every opponent earn every basket and every victory through physical, grinding basketball that tested both skill and will. The Bulls of the 1970s developed a reputation that was captured in a phrase that became synonymous with the franchise during that era, the hardest working team in sports. It wasn't a self-proclaimed nickname, wasn't marketing language created by the franchise to generate interest. It was recognition earned through the way the Bulls played night after night, season after season, competing with an intensity and an effort level that seemed almost unsustainable but that they maintained year after year. Other teams might have more talented players, might have Hall of Famers or All-Stars who could dominate games through individual brilliance, but nobody was going to outwork the Bulls. Nobody was going to want it more. Nobody was going to match their physicality and their relentless defensive pressure. The identity of those 1970s Bulls was embodied by three players who became the faces of the franchise during that decade, who exemplified everything Dick Motta wanted his teams to be, who made the hardest working team in sports more than just a slogan but a reality that opponents experienced every time they faced Chicago. Jerry Sloan, Norm Van Lier, and Bob Love formed the core of those Bulls teams, each bringing something essential to the culture and the style that made Chicago so difficult to play against. Jerry Sloan was the heart and soul of the 1970s Bulls, a guard who played with a ferocity and a toughness that seemed to define not just his own game but the entire franchise's approach to basketball. Sloan wasn't the most talented player in the league, wasn't blessed with overwhelming athleticism or offensive skills that made him unguardable. But what he had was an absolutely relentless competitive fire, a refusal to give up on any play or any possession, a willingness to sacrifice his body diving for loose balls and taking charges and defending the opponent's best player for 40 minutes regardless of size or skill level. He played every game like it was a playoff elimination game, every possession like it was the final one of his career, with an intensity that never wavered regardless of score or situation. Sloan's style of play earned him a nickname that would forever connect him to the franchise he represented, the Original Bull. The moniker captured everything about how he played: fierce, physical, unstoppable when fully committed, embodying the toughness and the work ethic that the Bulls wanted to be known for. When people thought about the Chicago Bulls in the 1970s, they thought about Jerry Sloan, about the way he competed, about the standard he set for effort and intensity that his teammates had to match if they wanted to share the court with him. He made 10 all-defensive team selections during his career, recognition that he was one of the best defensive players in the entire league year after year, that his relentless style actually translated to results, and not just to admiration from coaches who appreciated hard work. Alongside Sloan in the backcourt was Norm Van Lier, another guard who brought defensive intensity and toughness that complemented Sloan's style perfectly. Van Lier was slightly smaller but just as fierce, another player who took pride in defense, who viewed shutting down the opponent's best guard as more important than his own offensive statistics, who competed on every possession with a determination that made him one of the most respected defenders in the league. Together, Sloan and Van Lier formed one of the most intimidating defensive backcourts in the NBA, a pairing that could pressure ball handlers, deny passing lanes, and make initiating offense against the Bulls an exhausting, frustrating experience. At forward, Bob Love provided the offensive firepower that the defensively oriented Bulls needed to actually win games rather than just keeping them close. Love was a scorer who could get buckets in multiple ways: jump shots, drives to the basket, post-ups where he could use his size and skill to create advantages. He made 3 consecutive All-Star teams in the early 1970s, recognition that he was among the league's best forwards, that his offensive production was as essential to the Bulls' success as Sloan and Van Lier's defensive intensity. Love brought balance to the Bulls, ensured they weren't just a defensive team that struggled to score, gave them a reliable offensive weapon who could carry the scoring load on nights when the grinded-out approach wasn't generating enough points. The combination of Sloan's defensive ferocity, Van Lier's backcourt toughness, and Love's offensive production created Bulls teams that were consistently competitive throughout the 1970s, that made the playoffs regularly, that earned respect from opponents who knew that playing Chicago meant enduring physical, bruising basketball for 48 minutes. The Bulls embraced that style, took pride in it, built their identity around being tougher and more committed than teams with more talent. Adding to the challenges the Bulls faced during the 1970s was a quirk of NBA geography and conference alignment that seemed almost absurd given the team's location. Despite being a Chicago team, despite being located in the Midwest and surrounded by cities that were clearly in the eastern part of the United States, the Bulls spent most of the decade assigned to the Western Conference. The NBA's conference alignment in those years wasn't based strictly on geography, but rather on trying to balance competitive strength and create interesting divisional races, and that meant teams were sometimes placed in conferences that didn't match their actual location on a map. For the Bulls, Being in the Western Conference meant facing some of the most dominant teams and players in NBA history as regular opponents and potential playoff matchups. The Los Angeles Lakers, with Jerry West and later Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, were Western Conference powerhouses who the Bulls had to compete against for playoff positioning. The Milwaukee Bucks, with Abdul-Jabbar before his trade to Los Angeles and later with emerging talents, were another Western Conference juggernaut that stood between the Bulls and any dreams of reaching the NBA Finals. These were teams with Hall of Fame talents, teams that were built to win championships, and the Bulls had to face them not as occasional opponents but as conference rivals, as teams they needed to beat in playoff series if they wanted to advance deep into the postseason. The Western Conference placement made the Bulls' path to championships even more difficult than it would have been in the Eastern Conference, created additional obstacles beyond just building a good team. You could be excellent, could win 50 games and play championship-caliber basketball, and still find yourself facing the Lakers or Bucks in the second round of the playoffs, needing to upset a team with multiple Hall of Famers just to reach the conference finals. The geography and the conference alignment weren't fair, but the Bulls never complained, never made excuses. They just kept working, kept competing, kept embodying that hardest working team in sports identity regardless of how difficult the path to a championship might be. From earning recognition as the hardest working team in sports to the leadership of Jerry Sloan, Norm Van Lier, and Bob Love, from the bruising defensive style and physical play that defined their identity to the challenge of competing in the Western Conference against Lakers and Bucks powerhouses, the 1970s Bulls were gritty, respected, consistently competitive, even when championships remained out of reach. The original Bull and his teammates set a standard for effort and toughness that would become part of the franchise's legacy, that would be remembered long after the decade ended, and new stars arrived to take the Bulls to heights that the 1970s teams never quite reached. The foundation that Dick Motta had built, the defensive identity established by Jerry Sloan and Norm Van Lier, the offensive production provided by Bob Love. All of it was coming together in the early 1970s in ways that produced regular season success that rivaled almost any team in the NBA. The Bulls weren't just competitive anymore, weren't just the hardest working team that made opponents earn everything. They were genuinely excellent, winning games at rates that demonstrated they belonged among the league's elite, that they could compete with anyone over the course of an 82-game season. Between 1971 and 1975, the Chicago Bulls won 50 or more games in 4 consecutive seasons, a remarkable stretch of sustained excellence that few franchises could match. 50 wins in an NBA season is the benchmark for a truly good team, the dividing line between playoff participants and genuine championship contenders, and the Bulls weren't just hitting that mark once but sustaining it year after year. The 1971-72 season brought the peak of this run, with Chicago winning 57 games against just 25 losses, a winning percentage of nearly 70% that ranked among the best records in the entire league that year. 57 wins should have translated to deep playoff runs, should have meant conference championships and NBA Finals appearances, should have brought the ultimate success that regular season excellence is supposed to produce. The Bulls were playing championship-caliber basketball for months at a time, beating the best teams in the league, demonstrating through 82 games that they had the talent and the coaching and the system to win at the highest levels. But regular season success and playoff success are two different things, and the Bulls of the early 1970s would learn this lesson in the most painful ways possible. The playoffs brought heartbreak after heartbreak, early exits that seemed impossible given how dominant the Bulls had been during the regular season, losses that couldn't be explained by lack of talent or effort or preparation. Sometimes the matchups were difficult, facing those Lakers and Bucks powerhouses in early rounds because of the Western Conference placement that created brutal playoff brackets. Sometimes the breaks didn't go Chicago's way, close games decided by 1 or 2 possessions that could have gone either way. But regardless of the reasons, the results were the same. The Bulls couldn't advance as far as their regular season record suggested they should, couldn't translate 57-win seasons into NBA Finals appearances. The closest the Bulls came during this era, the moment that would haunt the franchise and its fans for years, came in 1975 when Chicago advanced to the Western Conference Finals and stood just 2 games away from reaching the NBA Finals for the first time in franchise history. Their opponent was the Golden State Warriors, a team the Bulls had every reason to believe they could beat, a matchup that seemed winnable if Chicago could execute and maintain the defensive intensity that had carried them all season. The series went the distance, back and forth, neither team able to seize control, coming down to a Game 7 that would determine who would advance to the finals and who would go home with their season ended. Game 7 was heartbreaking in ways that are difficult to fully capture, a contest where the Bulls fought and competed and gave everything they had but came up just short, losing in a manner that felt cruel and unfair given how close they had come. The Warriors advanced to the finals while the Bulls went home, 2 games short of the ultimate goal, so close they could almost touch it but not quite able to complete the final step. For Jerry Sloan and the other Bulls veterans who had worked so hard and who had built such an impressive regular season record, the loss was devastating. This had been their chance, their window, and it had closed without delivering the finals appearance they had earned through years of relentless effort. The Bulls never reached the finals during this era, despite the 4 straight 50-win seasons, despite being among the league's best teams year after year, despite having the talent and the coaching and everything necessary to win championships. The playoff heartbreaks accumulated, the what-ifs and the near-misses piling up, creating a painful legacy of regular season excellence without ultimate playoff success. The 1970s Bulls were respected, were competitive, were proof that hard work and defense could produce winning basketball, but they weren't champions, couldn't break through to the finals no matter how many regular season games they won. But even without championships, even without finals appearances, the 1970s Bulls created moments and records and experiences that would become part of franchise lore, that would be remembered and celebrated long after the disappointments faded. On January 8, 1970, center Tom Boerwinkle put on a rebounding performance for the ages, grabbing 37 rebounds in a single game against the Phoenix Suns. 37 rebounds, a number so high it seems almost impossible in the modern game, where possessions are faster and where teams prioritize spacing and shooting over offensive rebounding and second chances. Boerwinkle's 37-rebound game set a franchise record that still stands over 50 years later, a mark that seems increasingly unlikely to ever be broken as the game continues to evolve away from the physical, grinding style that produced such rebounding totals. The Bulls played their home games during this era at the legendary Chicago Stadium, a venue that would become as much a part of the franchise's identity as any player or coach, a building that created atmosphere and intimidation in ways that few arenas in professional sports could match. The stadium was located on Madison Street on Chicago's west side, and it earned a nickname that captured everything about the experience of watching basketball there, the Madhouse on Madison. The name wasn't marketing hyperbole. It was an accurate description of what happened when the Bulls were playing well and the crowd was fully engaged. The noise levels at Chicago Stadium were deafening, almost physically painful, the building's acoustics somehow amplifying crowd noise to levels that visiting players found disorienting and overwhelming. When the Bulls were on defense and the crowd was roaring, opponents couldn't hear their own plays being called, couldn't communicate on the floor, found themselves making mistakes simply because the noise made coordination and execution almost impossible. The organ that played during breaks became famous throughout the league, the organist creating moments that added to the building's unique atmosphere, that made Bulls games at Chicago Stadium experiences that players and fans remembered for decades. The defensive identity that defined the 1970s Bulls produced another franchise record on October 18, 1974, when Chicago held the Utah Jazz to just 4 points in a single quarter, setting an NBA record for defensive dominance that demonstrated just how suffocating Dick Motta's defensive systems could be when executed perfectly. 4 points in an entire quarter meant the Jazz were barely scoring once every 3 minutes, that the Bulls were denying shots and forcing turnovers and making offense almost impossible. The record stood as proof that defense really could win games, that the hard-nosed style Chicago had embraced could produce results that were measurable and historic, not just admirable in abstract ways. In 1976, when the ABA and NBA merged and several ABA teams and players joined the NBA, the Bulls had an opportunity to acquire a legitimate star who could restore some of the offensive firepower that had been missing since Bob Love's decline. They acquired Artis Gilmore, a center who had been one of the ABA's dominant players, a 7-footer with skills and production that made him an immediate impact player at the NBA level. Gilmore brought star power back to the Bulls, gave them a post presence they had been lacking, created hope that maybe this new addition could be the piece that finally pushed Chicago over the top and delivered the championship that had eluded them throughout the 1970s. From 4 consecutive 50-win seasons to the heartbreaking Game 7 loss in the 1975 Western Conference Finals, From never reaching the finals despite elite regular season success to Tom Boerwinkel's 37 rebounds, from the deafening madhouse on Madison to holding Utah to 4 points in a quarter, from Artis Gilmore's arrival to the records and moments that defined an era. The 1970s Bulls were excellent without being champions, creating a legacy of toughness and effort and regular season dominance that couldn't quite translate to the ultimate playoff success. The heartbreak was real, the disappointment genuine, but the foundation being built and the identity being established would endure, would become part of what the Bulls were, waiting for the next era when championships would finally arrive. The late 1970s had been difficult for the Chicago Bulls, the glory years of 50-win seasons and playoff appearances fading into mediocrity and decline as the core players aged, as injuries accumulated, as the roster that had been so competitive earlier in the decade gradually eroded without adequate replacements being found through the draft or free agency. The 1978-79 season brought particularly disappointing results, the Bulls finishing well below .500 and missing the playoffs, enduring a losing season that was painful for fans who remembered when Chicago had been among the league's elite teams, when the madhouse on Madison had been filled with deafening crowds celebrating victories rather than watching defeat. But there was a silver lining to the losing, a potential benefit that came from finishing with one of the worst records in the NBA, draft position. The NBA draft in 1979 would feature one of the most celebrated prospects in basketball history, a player from Michigan State who had captivated the nation during the college basketball season, who had led his team to the NCAA championship in a finals game that had become one of the most watched basketball games in television history. Earvin Magic Johnson was his name, and he was considered a generational talent, a 6'9" point guard who could do things that players his size weren't supposed to be able to do, who could pass and handle the ball like a much smaller player while also rebounding and scoring, who brought charisma and leadership that seemed to elevate everyone around him. Every team in the NBA wanted Magic Johnson, understood that drafting him could transform a franchise, that adding a player of his caliber was the kind of opportunity that came along once in a generation. The Los Angeles Lakers, despite being a historically successful franchise with a strong roster, had finished with a poor record in the 1978-79 season due to injuries and underperformance, giving them a chance at the first overall pick in the draft. The Chicago Bulls, with their own disappointing season, also had a chance at that top selection, at the opportunity to draft Magic Johnson and pair him with Artis Gilmore and build around a core that could potentially return Chicago to championship contention. But the Bulls and Lakers had finished with identical records, both teams winning and losing the exact same number of games during the regular season. When two teams finish with the same record and both are in contention for the first overall pick, the NBA needed a tiebreaker, a method to determine which franchise would get the first selection and which would pick second. In 1979, the league's tiebreaker was simple and dramatic: a coin flip. One team would call heads or tails, a coin would be flipped, and whichever team won the flip would get the first overall pick and the right to select Magic Johnson. The other team would pick second, would get a consolation prize, would forever wonder what might have been if the coin had landed differently. The coin was flipped, gravity and chance and random probability determining which franchise would draft a generational talent and which would be left with the second choice. When the coin landed, when the result was announced, the Los Angeles Lakers had won. They would pick first, would select Magic Johnson, would pair him with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and build a dynasty that would win multiple championships throughout the 1980s, would create Showtime basketball that would define an era and make the Lakers one of the most successful and glamorous franchises in all of professional sports. The Bulls had lost. They would pick second, would watch Magic Johnson go to Los Angeles, would have to find someone else to select with their consolation prize. The player they chose was David Greenwood, a forward from UCLA who was a solid prospect, who had college credentials and skills that suggested he could be a productive NBA player. And Greenwood did have a respectable NBA career. He was competent, professional, a player who could contribute to winning teams in supporting roles. But he wasn't Magic Johnson, wasn't a generational talent who could transform a franchise, wasn't someone who would lead teams to championships and redefine what was possible at his position. The coin flip became one of the most painful what-ifs in Chicago Bulls franchise history, a moment that haunted the organization and its fans for years. What if the coin had landed differently? What if the Bulls had won the flip and drafted Magic Johnson? What if Magic had come to Chicago instead of Los Angeles, had played in the madhouse on Madison instead of in the Forum, had teamed with artist Gilmore and whatever other talent the Bulls could have assembled around such a transcendent player. Would the Bulls have won championships in the early 1980s instead of the Lakers? Would Magic have thrived in Chicago the way he did in Los Angeles? Or would the different circumstances and different supporting cast have prevented him from reaching his full potential? The pain of losing the coin flip for Magic Johnson in 1979 was compounded by what followed in the early 1980s, as the Chicago Bulls fell into a decline that was deeper and more prolonged than even the most pessimistic fans could have imagined. The franchise that had won 50 games 4 straight seasons in the early 1970s, that had been known as the hardest working team in sports, that had made the Madhouse on Madison one of the most intimidating venues in professional basketball, that franchise seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by a team that couldn't compete, couldn't win consistently, couldn't give fans any reason to believe that better days were coming. The early 1980s brought a stretch of futility that tested the loyalty of even the most devoted Bulls supporters. From 1980 through 1983, spanning 4 seasons that should have been years of building and improving, the Bulls missed the playoffs in 3 of those 4 years, posting losing records and finishing near the bottom of their division, looking more like an expansion team still trying to find its footing than like an established franchise with nearly 2 decades of history. The single playoff appearance during that stretch in 1981 was brief and unsatisfying, an early exit that provided no real hope that the team was turning a corner or building towards sustained success. The losing records accumulated with depressing regularity, seasons ending with the Bulls having won fewer than half their games, sitting at home while other teams competed in the playoffs, watching the postseason on television like fans rather than participants. The 1981-82 season brought a 34-48 record. The 1982-83 campaign was even worse at 28-54, a winning percentage barely above .300 that put Chicago among the worst teams in the entire NBA. These weren't narrow misses, weren't seasons where the Bulls came close to .500 and just fell short. These were genuinely bad teams that were being outplayed and outclassed regularly, that were losing by margins that suggested fundamental problems with talent, coaching, and organizational direction. The coaching situation became a revolving door, a parade of different voices and different systems that never seemed to stick, that never produced the sustained improvement necessary to return the Bulls to relevance. Jerry Sloan, the original Bull who had embodied everything great about the 1970s teams, was given a chance to coach after his playing career ended, hired in 1979 with hopes that his competitive fire and his understanding of what made Bulls basketball successful could translate to coaching. But Sloan's intensity and his demanding style, which had made him a great player, didn't produce the same results when he was on the sideline rather than on the court. The roster he was working with lacked the talent and the toughness that his 1970s teams had possessed, and telling players to work harder and compete more intensely couldn't overcome the fundamental talent deficiency that limited what the Bulls could accomplish. Sloan was let go after less than 3 full seasons, his coaching record well below .500, his attempt to recreate the culture and identity of his playing days having failed to produce results. The decision to fire Sloan was painful for the organization and for fans who loved him, but the losing had become unacceptable and something needed to change. The coaching search that followed brought more changes, more new systems, more promises that this time would be different, but the results remained stubbornly poor. The losing continued, and the Bulls kept cycling through coaches hoping to find someone who could fix what was broken. The coaching changes highlighted how far the team had fallen from relevance, how the Bulls had gone from being one of the NBA's most respected franchises to being an afterthought, a team that other organizations barely noticed except as an easy opponent, a franchise that seemed to have lost its way and couldn't find a path back to competitiveness. The Madhouse on Madison still stood, still hosted Bulls games, but the building wasn't as full as it had been during the glory years, wasn't as loud, wasn't creating the kind of atmosphere that had once made it one of the most intimidating venues in professional basketball. Fans who had memories of Jerry Sloan diving for loose balls and 50-win seasons and Western Conference Finals appearances couldn't reconcile those memories with the reality of what the Bulls had become, a losing team that couldn't make the playoffs, that couldn't develop young players, that seemed stuck in a cycle of mediocrity with no clear plan for improvement. The early 1980s represented the low point in Chicago Bulls history since the franchise's founding, a period when the organization seemed to have lost its identity and its direction, when the future looked bleak and the past glory felt impossibly distant. The coin flip that had denied the Bulls the chance to draft Magic Johnson seemed like a turning point, the moment when the franchise's fortunes had shifted from competitive to feudal, from relevant to forgotten. The what-ifs about Magic in a Bulls uniform became more painful with each losing season, each missed playoff appearance, each coaching change that failed to produce improvement. But even in the darkness of the early 1980s struggles, even when the present was painful and the future uncertain, the franchise was positioning itself, perhaps unknowingly, for another chance at drafting transformational talent, for another opportunity to select a player who could change everything. The losing seasons that were so difficult to endure were also creating draft position, moving the Bulls higher in the lottery, giving them better odds of landing a top pick in future drafts. The coaching changes and the roster turnover, as chaotic and frustrating as they were clearing out the remnants of teams that hadn't worked and creating space for something new to be built. From missing the playoffs in 3 of 4 seasons to the coaching carousel that saw Jerry Sloan and others come and go, from losing records that put the Bulls among the league's worst teams to the fall from relevance that seemed complete and total, the early 1980s were the wilderness years, the low point that had to be endured before the salvation could arrive. The Bulls and their fans couldn't know it yet, couldn't see the future that was coming. But the struggles of the early 1980s were setting the stage for the transformation that would begin in 1984, when a player from North Carolina would be selected with the 3rd overall pick and would begin the journey toward making the Chicago Bulls into champions. The 1984 NBA draft brought an opportunity that the Chicago Bulls desperately needed, a chance to select a player who could transform the franchise from the losing and mediocrity that had defined the early 1980s into something competitive, something relevant, something worth watching again. The Bulls held the 3rd overall pick, earned through another disappointing season that had kept them out of the playoffs, but that had at least produced the draft position necessary to potentially select a franchise-altering talent. The draft class was loaded with future stars and Hall of Famers, one of the deepest and most talented groups of prospects in NBA history. The Houston Rockets held the 1st pick and selected Hakeem Olajuwon, a dominant center from the University of Houston, who would go on to have a spectacular career and win championships. The Portland Trail Blazers picked 2nd and chose Sam Bowie, a center from Kentucky who had size and skills but whose career would be derailed by injuries and who would forever be remembered not for what he accomplished but for being picked ahead of the player who went 3rd. With the 3rd selection in the 1984 NBA draft, the Chicago Bulls chose Michael Jordan, a guard from the University of North Carolina who had hit the game-winning shot in the 1982 NCAA championship game and who had been the College Player of the Year in 1984. Jordan was athletic and skilled, could score and defend, brought competitiveness and work ethic that his college coach Dean Smith had cultivated, and seemed like someone who could immediately help the Bulls become more competitive, even if nobody quite understood just how transformational he would eventually become. Jordan's arrival in Chicago was immediate and electric. His NBA debut came on October 26, 1984, a regular season game that at the time seemed like just another basketball game, but that would later be recognized as a historic moment, the beginning of the greatest career in basketball history. The ticket stub from that game, a piece of cardboard that originally cost maybe $15 or $20, would decades later sell at auction for $264,000, a staggering sum that reflected not the intrinsic value of the paper but the historical significance of having been present for Jordan's first NBA game, for witnessing the moment when greatness first stepped onto an NBA court in a Bulls uniform. From his very first game, Jordan was spectacular in ways that announced he wasn't just another good player but something special, something the league hadn't quite seen before. His athleticism was obvious. He could jump higher than almost anyone, could glide through the air in ways that seemed to defy gravity, could dunk with power and creativity that made highlight reels and that drew gasps from crowds. But it wasn't just the athleticism that made Jordan special. It was the combination of physical gifts with skills and competitiveness and an almost obsessive drive to win that separated him from other talented players. Jordan's rookie season brought statistics that were remarkable for a first-year player. He averaged 28.2 points per game, instantly becoming one of the league's premier scorers despite being just 21 years old and adjusting to the NBA's speed and physicality. He made the All-Star team, was named Rookie of the Year, and transformed the Bulls from a team that fans had largely abandoned into a must-watch attraction. The Madhouse on Madison started filling up again. People coming to see this rookie who was doing things that seemed impossible, who was making the Bulls entertaining and exciting in ways they hadn't been in years. The franchise transformation was immediate and visible. Attendance surged, television ratings increased, and the Bulls went from being an afterthought in the NBA to being one of the league's most interesting teams despite not yet being championship contenders. Jordan's individual brilliance made every Bulls game worth watching, even when they lost, which they still did with regularity. Fans got to see spectacular dunks and scoring performances that justified the price of admission. But individual brilliance and team success are two different things, and the late 1980s would teach Jordan and the Bulls painful lessons about what it takes to not just compete but to actually win championships. Despite Jordan's scoring and his all-star selections and his growing reputation as the league's most exciting player, the Bulls were eliminated early in the playoffs multiple times, unable to advance deep into the postseason despite having the best player on the court most nights. The roster around Jordan wasn't championship caliber, lacking the depth and the complementary talents necessary to beat the NBA's elite teams in 7-game playoff series. The 1987 NBA draft brought two selections that would prove crucial to eventually building a championship team, two players who would become essential parts of the core that would dominate the 1990s. With the 5th overall pick, the Bulls selected Scottie Pippen, a small forward from the University of Central Arkansas who had played at a small school and who wasn't a household name but who had length and athleticism and versatility that the Bulls scouts believed could be developed. Later in the first round, Chicago selected Horace Grant, a power forward from Clemson who brought toughness and rebounding and a work ethic that would make him a perfect complementary piece. Pippen and Grant needed time to develop, needed to adjust to the NBA's speed and learn their roles. But their arrival marked the beginning of something special being built around Jordan. The combination of Jordan's superstar talent, Pippen's developing all-around game, and Grant's interior toughness created a core that could potentially compete for championships if the pieces continued to develop and if the right supporting cast could be assembled around them. By the 1988 season, the improvement was visible in the standings. The Bulls won 50 games for the first time in over a decade, matching the success of those 1970s teams and proving that the Jordan era wasn't just about individual highlights but about actual winning, about building towards sustained excellence. 50 wins earned the Bulls respect around the league, demonstrated that Chicago was no longer a rebuilding franchise but a legitimate playoff contender with a superstar and a supporting cast that was learning how to win. But the playoffs continued to bring heartbreak and painful lessons about the gap between being good and being champions. The defining obstacle of the late 1980s Bulls was the Detroit Pistons, a team that had been building toward championship contention themselves and that had developed a physical, almost brutal style of play that was designed specifically to neutralize Jordan and to exploit the Bulls' relative inexperience and lack of depth. The Pistons employed what became known as the Jordan rules, a defensive scheme that involved double-teaming Jordan whenever he touched the ball, physically hammering him with hard fouls, and daring the other Bulls players to beat them rather than allowing Jordan to take over games. The playoff series against Detroit were fierce and physical, the Pistons pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable contact, the Bulls trying to match that physicality but ultimately falling short. Jordan would score his points, would have his spectacular individual performances, but the Pistons would win the series, would advance while the Bulls went home disappointed and frustrated. The 1988 playoffs brought a loss to Detroit in the second round. The 1989 playoffs brought another defeat to the Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals, Chicago winning 2 games but losing 4, coming so close to reaching the NBA Finals but unable to break through against Detroit's championship-caliber team. The Pistons' losses defined the era, created a rivalry that was intense and personal, that motivated Jordan and the Bulls to keep improving, to keep adding pieces, to keep working toward the day when they could finally beat Detroit and advance to the finals. The losses were painful but educational, teaching Jordan and Pippen and Grant what championship-level playoff basketball required, showing them the physicality and the mental toughness necessary to win in June rather than just in January. From Jordan's selection 3rd overall to his 28.2 points per game rookie season and Rookie of the Year award, from the $264,000 ticket stub that reflected his debut's historical significance to the early playoff eliminations despite his brilliance, from drafting Pippen and Grant to forming the championship core. From winning 50 games in 1988 to the fierce playoff losses to Detroit's Pistons, the late 1980s were about Jordan arriving and transforming the franchise while the Bulls learned the difficult lessons necessary to eventually become champions. The foundation was being built, the core assembled, the experiences accumulated, all pointing toward the breakthrough that would finally come in the 1990s when the Bulls would stop falling short and would start winning the championships that Jordan's talent suggested were inevitable. The late 1980s playoff losses to the Detroit Pistons, the frustration of having the league's best player in Michael Jordan but being unable to advance to the NBA Finals, the sense that something fundamental needed to change if the Bulls were going to break through to championship contention, all of it created pressure on the organization to make difficult decisions about the team's direction. Doug Collins had been the Bulls' head coach since 1986, had overseen Jordan's development and the improvement that had brought 50-win seasons and playoff appearances, had built relationships with the players and had earned respect for his basketball knowledge and his ability to communicate. But Collins' system was built around Jordan's individual brilliance, asking him to carry enormous offensive responsibilities while the other players watched or provided support. Jordan would isolate, would create his own shots, would score 30 or 40 points while his teammates stood on the perimeter waiting for their occasional opportunities. The approach worked in the regular season, produced wins and exciting basketball, but in the playoffs against championship-caliber teams like the Pistons who could throw multiple defenders at Jordan and who could physically punish him possession after possession, the isolation-heavy offense became predictable and stoppable. Jordan was exhausted from carrying the offensive load. His teammates weren't developing the rhythm and involvement necessary to contribute when defenses focused entirely on stopping the superstar, and the Bulls couldn't score efficiently enough in crucial playoff games to beat the league's elite teams. After the 1989 playoff loss to Detroit, the Bulls management made a change that seemed risky at the time, but that would prove to be one of the most important decisions in franchise history. They fired Doug Collins. Despite his success in improving the team's regular season record, despite his relationship with Jordan, despite the fact that he was a good coach who had done much of what he'd been asked to do. The decision was painful but necessary. The Bulls needed a different approach, a different system, a coach who could unlock the full potential of the roster rather than relying almost entirely on Jordan's individual greatness. The replacement was Phil Jackson, who had been an assistant coach on Collins' staff and who brought a very different philosophy and personality to the head coaching position. Jackson was cerebral and unconventional, influenced by Eastern philosophy and by ideas about team chemistry and collective consciousness that seemed odd in the hyper-competitive world of professional basketball. He talked about the team as an organism, about finding ways to involve all 5 players on the court rather than having 4 players watch while one player dominated, about creating a system where everyone had responsibilities and where success required collective execution rather than individual heroics. Jackson's background was unique for an NBA head coach. He had played in the league for 13 years, mostly with the New York Knicks, experiencing championship success as a role player on teams that won through defense and teamwork rather than through superstar dominance. After his playing career ended, he had coached in the Continental Basketball Association, a minor league where experimentation and innovation were more accepted than in the NBA, where coaches could try unconventional ideas without the intense scrutiny that came with coaching at the highest level. His time as an assistant with the Bulls had given him insight into the roster's strengths and weaknesses, had allowed him to observe Jordan up close and to understand both his greatness and the limitations of building everything around his isolation scoring. But Jackson didn't arrive with a system of his own. His genius was in recognizing that someone else had already developed the perfect offensive scheme for the Bulls' personnel, and in having the wisdom to implement that system even though it would require changing everything about how the team played offense. That someone was Tex Winter, an assistant coach who had been with the Bulls since 1985 and who had spent decades developing and refining an offensive philosophy called the triangle offense. The triangle offense was complex and demanding, requiring all 5 players to be constantly moving, reading the defense, making decisions based on how opponents reacted rather than following predetermined plays. The system was built on spacing and ball movement and player movement, creating triangles of 3 players on one side of the court while 2 players worked on the weak side, with the configuration constantly shifting based on defensive rotations. Every player touched the ball. Every player had opportunities to score or to facilitate. Every player needed to understand their options and responsibilities within the system's framework. Tex Winter had been advocating for the triangle offense throughout his time with the Bulls, trying to convince Doug Collins to implement it, arguing that the system would make the team more efficient and harder to defend than the isolation-heavy approach they were using. But Collins had resisted. believing that unleashing Jordan's individual brilliance was more effective than asking him to play within a structured system that would limit his touches and his freedom to create. Winter's ideas had been politely acknowledged but largely ignored, his offensive philosophy sitting unused while the Bulls relied on Jordan to carry them. Phil Jackson's first major decision as head coach was to install the triangle offense, to give Tex Winter the authority to teach the system and to demand that the players, including and especially Michael Jordan, commit to learning it and executing it even when it felt uncomfortable or restrictive. The decision was risky because it required asking the league's best player to change how he played, to accept fewer isolation opportunities, to trust that the system would produce better results than his individual brilliance could generate on its own. Jordan was skeptical initially, resistant to the idea that he needed to play within a system, rather than creating his own shots whenever he wanted them. He had spent years being the Bulls' entire offense, had won scoring titles and all-star selections, and had carried the team to 50-win seasons through his individual dominance. Why should he change what had worked? Why should he subordinate his game to some complex system that Tex Winter insisted would be better? The early practices and games with the triangle were frustrating, the offense looking disjointed as players learned their spots and their reads, the ball not always ending up in Jordan's hands when he wanted it, the scoring becoming more distributed rather than concentrated in the superstars' performances. But Jackson was patient and persistent, convinced that the triangle would ultimately unlock championship-level offense that the isolation approach never could. He worked with Jordan individually, explaining how the system would actually make his scoring easier by creating better opportunities, by keeping defenses honest, by ensuring that opponents couldn't just load up on him because other players would be involved and dangerous. He emphasized that the triangle didn't mean Jordan would score less. It meant he would score more efficiently, with less energy expenditure, in ways that would keep him fresher for fourth quarters and for the playoffs when championships were won. Slowly, gradually, Jordan began to buy in, began to see how the triangle created spacing and movement that made even his isolation opportunities better, because defenses couldn't afford to help as much. Scottie Pippen thrived in the system, his versatility and his basketball IQ making him perfect for the triangle's demands. Horace Grant benefited from increased touches and involvement, his offense improving because he wasn't just standing in the corner waiting while Jordan worked. The entire team started to function differently, playing with more flow and cohesion, looking less like one superstar and four supporters and more like five players working together toward collective success. The triangle offense would become synonymous with Bulls basketball over the next decade, would power championship teams that dominated the NBA in ways that the isolation-heavy approach never could have. Phil Jackson's installation of the system, his partnership with Tex Winter, his ability to convince Michael Jordan to trust the process, all of it represented a transformation in how the Bulls played basketball, a shift from individual brilliance to collective excellence that would prove essential to finally breaking through and winning the championships that had remained elusive throughout the 1980s. From Jackson's hiring after the 1989 season to his unconventional philosophy and cerebral approach, from Tex Winter's triangle offense that had been waiting to be implemented to the complexity and demands of the system that required all five players to be engaged, from Jordan's initial skepticism to his gradual buy-in and understanding. From the team's transformation from isolation to collective execution, the installation of the triangle offense under Phil Jackson marked a turning point in Bulls history. The moment when the franchise shifted from being very good to being positioned for greatness, from being competitive to being ready to become champions. The 1990-91 season began with the triangle offense now fully implemented, with Phil Jackson entering his second year as head coach, with Michael Jordan having accepted that playing within the system made him and the Bulls better than his individual brilliance alone could achieve. The roster had continuity and experience. Scottie Pippen was developing into one of the league's best all-around players. Horace Grant was providing interior toughness and rebounding, and the supporting cast had bought into Jackson's philosophy about collective execution and team-first basketball. Everything was aligned for the Bulls to finally break through, to finally deliver the championship that Chicago had been chasing since the franchise's founding 25 years earlier. The regular season brought validation of everything the Bulls had been building. They won 61 games against just 21 losses, the best record in the entire NBA, dominating opponents night after night through the balanced offense that the triangle created and through improved defense that Jackson emphasized. Jordan was still the focal point, still the best player on the floor most nights, But now he had Pippen creating and scoring alongside him, had Grant cleaning up inside, had role players like John Paxson and Bill Cartwright making crucial contributions because the system involved everyone and created opportunities for whoever had the advantageous matchup. The 61 wins earned the Bulls the top seed in the Eastern Conference playoffs, giving them home court advantage throughout and positioning them for the deep playoff run that had eluded them in previous years. But regular season success meant nothing. The Bulls had won 50 games before, had been highly seeded before, and had still fallen short when facing Detroit and other elite teams in the playoffs. This time needed to be different. This time the triangle and the development and the buy-in needed to translate to playoff victories and ultimately to the championship that would validate everything. The early playoff rounds brought convincing victories, the Bulls advancing through the first and second rounds with the kind of dominance that suggested they were ready for this moment. And then came the Eastern Conference Finals, where once again the Bulls would face the Detroit Pistons, the team that had eliminated them in heartbreaking fashion in 1988, 1989, and 1990, the team that had employed the Jordan rules and physical intimidation to prevent Chicago from reaching the finals despite having the league's best player. But this time was different. The Bulls weren't just Michael Jordan and four supporting players hoping to survive Detroit's physicality. They were a complete team executing a system that created advantages the Pistons couldn't neutralize through physical play and double teams. Scottie Pippen could attack when Jordan drew attention. Horace Grant could score inside when perimeter defenders collapsed, and the triangle's spacing prevented Detroit from loading up on Jordan the way they had in previous years. The series was a sweep. 4 games. 4 Bulls victories. Detroit eliminated without winning even once. The Bad Boys era that had dominated the Eastern Conference and that had won back-to-back championships officially ended by the team they had tormented for years. The sweep of Detroit was cathartic for Jordan and for the Bulls organization, revenge for the playoff heartbreaks and validation that the years of losing to the Pistons had taught valuable lessons about what championship basketball required. The physical punishment Jordan had endured in those series, the frustration of being good enough but not quite ready, the development needed to build a complete team rather than just relying on one superstar. All of it had been necessary. All of it had led to this moment when the Bulls could finally eliminate Detroit and advance to the NBA Finals for the first time in franchise history. The finals matchup was against the Los Angeles Lakers, the team that had won the coin flip for Magic Johnson in 1979, the team that had built a dynasty throughout the 1980s while the Bulls struggled. Magic was nearing the end of his career. The Lakers were no longer the dominant force they had been, but they still had championship pedigree and finals experience that the Bulls lacked. The series would determine whether Chicago could finish what they had started, whether the regular season excellence and the playoff dominance could culminate in actually winning the championship. The Bulls won the series in 5 games, never trailing, executing the triangle offense brilliantly and defending with intensity that kept the Lakers from ever establishing rhythm. Jordan was spectacular, averaging over 30 points per game and earning Finals MVP honors, recognition as the best player in the series and validation that he could indeed deliver championships and not just scoring titles. When the final game ended, when the Bulls had secured the victory that made them NBA champions, the celebration in Chicago was enormous. 25 years of waiting, of playoff heartbreaks and near misses, of building and rebuilding, finally culminating in a championship that proved the Bulls belonged among the league's elite franchises. But one championship wasn't enough. Not for Jordan, whose competitive drive wouldn't allow satisfaction with a single title. Not for Phil Jackson, who believed the triangle could produce sustained excellence. Not for an organization that understood how rare championship cores are and how important it is to maximize them. The 1991-92 season brought another dominant regular season, another playoff run that culminated in defeating the Portland Trail Blazers in the finals, Jordan winning his second consecutive Finals MVP, and the Bulls proving that the first championship hadn't been a fluke but rather the beginning of sustained dominance. The 1992-93 season completed the three-peat, the Bulls defeating the Phoenix Suns in the finals to claim their third consecutive championship. Jordan won his third straight Finals MVP, cementing his status as the greatest player in basketball and perhaps the greatest ever. 3 championships in 3 years, 3 Finals MVP awards, the kind of dominance that only a handful of NBA franchises had ever achieved. The Bulls had joined the Lakers, Celtics, and a few other elite organizations as multiple-time champions, had created a dynasty that would be remembered for generations. Jordan was at the absolute peak of his powers, just 30 years old, showing no signs of decline, seemingly capable of winning championships for years to come. The natural assumption was that the Bulls would keep winning, would challenge for 4, 5, 6 consecutive titles, would dominate the NBA throughout the 1990s the way the Celtics had in the 1960s or the Lakers in the 1980s. The roster was intact. Jackson was still coaching, the triangle was humming, and Jordan was Jordan. Everything suggested more championships were inevitable. But on October 6, 1993, just months after winning the third championship, Michael Jordan held a press conference and announced his retirement from basketball. He was walking away at age 30, at the absolute peak of his dominance, after winning 3 straight titles and 3 straight finals MVPs, leaving the game when he was clearly still the best player on the planet. The announcement shocked the basketball world, seemed almost incomprehensible. Why would someone retire when they were dominating, when more championships seemed guaranteed, when they were writing one of the great chapters in sports history? Jordan cited the tragic murder of his father James Jordan earlier that summer, the loss of motivation and joy for basketball, the desire to pursue other challenges, including attempting to play professional baseball. The explanations made some sense emotionally. Grief and loss can change priorities, can make even the greatest achievements feel hollow, but they didn't make the retirement any less shocking or any less devastating for Bulls fans who had finally found championship success, only to watch their superstar walk away. From 61 wins and the first championship in 1991 to sweeping Detroit and ending the Bad Boys era, from 3 straight titles with Jordan earning Finals MVP each time to the shocking retirement in October 1993 at the peak of dominance, the first three-peat era brought both ultimate triumph and sudden, unexpected conclusion. The Bulls had finally become champions, had achieved everything the franchise had worked toward for decades, but the celebration was cut short. The dynasty interrupted just when it seemed capable of endless continuation. Jordan was gone, the greatest player in basketball had walked away, and the Bulls and their fans were left wondering what might have been if he had stayed, how many more championships could have been won, whether the interruption would prove temporary or permanent. Michael Jordan's retirement in October 1993 left the Chicago Bulls in an impossible situation, trying to defend their championship and compete for more titles without the player who had been the centerpiece of everything, who had won 3 straight Finals MVPs, who was universally recognized as the best player in basketball. The 1993-94 season brought surprisingly strong results despite Jordan's absence. Scottie Pippen emerged as a legitimate superstar in his own right. The triangle offense continued to function effectively, and the Bulls won 55 games and made the playoffs, proving they were still competitive even without their greatest player. But competitive wasn't championship caliber, and the playoffs brought a second-round loss that demonstrated the gap between being very good and being champions without Jordan. The 1994-95 season was more of the same, solid regular season play, Pippen continuing to excel, but the sense that something fundamental was missing, that the Bulls couldn't quite reach the level necessary to win championships no matter how well the other pieces performed. And then, in March 1995, everything changed. Jordan, who had spent over a year attempting to play professional baseball in the Chicago White Sox organization, decided to return to basketball. His baseball experiment hadn't produced the success he'd hoped for. The skills that made him the greatest basketball player in the world didn't translate to hitting 90-mile-per-hour fastballs, and the competitive fire that had driven him to 3 championships couldn't be satisfied by playing minor league baseball in front of small crowds. The announcement of Jordan's return came through a simple 2-word press release: "I'm back." Those 2 words electrified the basketball world, created immediate speculation about whether Jordan could recapture his pre-retirement form, whether the Bulls could immediately return to championship contention, whether the greatest player in basketball could simply walk back onto the court after 17 months away and dominate the way he had before. Jordan's first game back was in Indianapolis against the Pacers, and while he showed flashes of brilliance, he also looked rusty, his timing off, his conditioning not quite at the level required for NBA basketball. The Bulls made the playoffs but lost in the second round to the Orlando Magic, a young, talented team led by Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway. The loss was disappointing but understandable. Jordan had only played 17 regular season games after his return, hadn't had a full training camp or preseason to rebuild his conditioning and rhythm, and the Bulls hadn't had time to reintegrate him into the system and to adjust to having him back. The playoffs served as a learning experience, a reminder that even Michael Jordan needed preparation time, that greatness couldn't just be turned on and off like a switch. But the loss to Orlando also motivated Jordan in ways that would prove crucial for the following season. He spent the summer of 1995 training obsessively, rebuilding his body and his conditioning to levels that matched or exceeded what he'd had before retirement. He studied film of the Orlando series, identifying weaknesses in his game and in the Bulls roster, providing feedback to management about what pieces needed to be added to return the Bulls to championship form. The competitive fire that had dimmed during his baseball sabbatical was burning again, hotter than ever, focused on proving that his return wasn't just a nostalgic farewell tour, but a genuine attempt to reclaim his throne as the best player in basketball and to lead the Bulls back to championships. One of the roster changes the Bulls made before the 1995-96 season was acquiring Dennis Rodman, a rebounding specialist and defensive force who had played for the Detroit Pistons during their Bad Boys era and who had been one of Jordan's tormentors during those painful playoff losses in the late 1980s. Rodman was unconventional and controversial, known for his wild hair colors and eccentric behavior off the court. But on the court, he was a relentless rebounder and defender who could guard multiple positions and who brought intensity and toughness that complemented Jordan and Pippen perfectly. The combination of Jordan fully healthy and motivated, Pippen established as one of the league's premier all-around players, and Rodman added as the defensive and rebounding anchor created what would become the most dominant single-season team in NBA history. The 1995-96 Bulls weren't just good. They were historically great, winning with a consistency and a dominance that the league had never seen before. The regular season became a relentless march toward history. The Bulls won their first 12 games, then kept winning, losing only occasionally and usually bouncing back immediately with multiple game-winning streaks. Jordan was playing at an MVP level, looking every bit as good as he had before retirement, perhaps even better because of the motivation and the renewed appreciation for basketball that the time away had given him. Pippen was brilliant. Rodman was grabbing rebounds at rates that seemed impossible, and the supporting cast executed the triangle offense with precision that made the Bulls nearly unstoppable. As the season progressed, as the wins accumulated and the losses remained rare, people began to realize that the Bulls were chasing a record that had stood for 2 decades. The 1971-72 Los Angeles Lakers had won 69 games, the most ever in an NBA regular season, a mark that seemed almost untouchable given the difficulty of maintaining excellence across 82 games against the best basketball players in the world. But the Bulls were winning at a rate that suggested 70 wins might be possible, that they might become the first team in NBA history to reach that milestone. The chase for 70 wins created drama and tension down the stretch of the regular season, every game mattering not just for playoff positioning but for history. The Bulls needed to maintain their focus and intensity, even in games that didn't matter for seeding, needed to keep winning when fatigue and minor injuries might have justified resting players. But Jordan wouldn't allow complacency, wouldn't accept anything less than maximum effort in pursuit of the record, and his competitive drive pushed the entire team to keep competing for every victory. On April 16, 1996, the Bulls defeated the Washington Bullets to clinch their 70th victory of the season, becoming the first team in NBA history to win 70 games in a regular season. The final regular season record was 72-10, 72 wins against just 10 losses, a winning percentage of .878 that shattered the previous record and that established a new standard for regular season excellence. The record seemed almost untouchable, the kind of achievement that might stand for decades, that might never be matched given how difficult it is to sustain that level of dominance across an entire season. But regular season records meant nothing without playoff success. The 2007 New England Patriots would later go 16-0 in the regular season, only to lose the Super Bowl, proving that perfection in the regular season doesn't guarantee championship glory. The Bulls understood that 72 wins would be a footnote rather than a celebration if they didn't finish the job and win the championship. The playoffs brought dominant performances that matched the regular season excellence. The Bulls swept the Miami Heat in the first round, defeated the New York Knicks in 5 games in the second round, and swept the Orlando Magic, the team that had eliminated them the previous year, in the Eastern Conference Finals. The dominance was total, the Bulls losing just 1 playoff game en route to the finals, executing the triangle offense brilliantly, while Rodman controlled the glass and the defense suffocated opponents. The NBA Finals matched the Bulls against the Seattle Supersonics, a talented team led by Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp, who had won 64 games themselves and who brought their own championship aspirations to the series. The series was more competitive than the earlier playoff rounds, the Sonics winning 2 games and pushing the Bulls to 6 games before Chicago could close it out. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The Bulls were too good, too experienced, too motivated to let this championship slip away. Jordan won his 4th Finals MVP award, averaging nearly 30 points per game and delivering when the moments were biggest. The final tally for the 1995-96 Bulls was 87-13 when including both regular season and playoff games, an 87% winning percentage across the entire season that remains the best in NBA history. The combination of 72-10 in the regular season plus 15-3 in the playoffs created a season that would be remembered as perhaps the greatest ever by any team in any professional sport, a level of sustained dominance that seemed almost impossible to achieve. From Jordan's return in March 1995 to the motivation from the Orlando playoff loss, from adding Dennis Rodman to creating the perfect combination of Jordan-Pippen-Rodman, from the relentless chase for 70 wins to finishing 72-10 and becoming the first 70-win team ever, from playoff dominance to the championship that validated everything with an 87-13 overall record. The 1995-96 season was the greatest in Bulls history and arguably the greatest in NBA history, the moment when everything that made the Bulls special came together in perfect harmony to create something that had never been seen before and that might never be matched again. The 1995-96 championship and the historic 72-10 season had validated Michael Jordan's return from retirement, had proven that the Bulls could reclaim their throne as the NBA's dominant franchise, had demonstrated that the combination of Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman could produce basketball excellence at levels the league had rarely if ever seen. But one championship after returning from retirement wasn't enough. Not for Jordan, whose competitive drive demanded more, not for Phil Jackson, who believed the triangle offense and this core could continue winning, not for an organization that understood how rare championship windows are and how important it was to maximize every season while the pieces were still together. The 1996-97 season brought another dominant regular season, the Bulls winning 69 games and proving that the previous year's 72 wins hadn't been a fluke or a one-time achievement, but rather a reflection of sustained excellence. Jordan was still the best player in basketball, winning another scoring title and another MVP award, playing with the same intensity and competitive fire that had defined his entire career. Pippen continued to be one of the league's premier all-around players, capable of scoring, rebounding, defending, and facilitating at elite levels. Rodman kept grabbing rebounds at extraordinary rates, leading the league in rebounding despite being undersized for a power forward, his positioning and effort and relentless pursuit of every missed shot creating second-chance opportunities that made the Bulls' offense even more dangerous. The playoffs brought another journey to the finals, the Bulls advancing through the Eastern Conference with the same dominance they had shown the previous year. Their opponent in the 1997 finals was the Utah Jazz, a team led by future Hall of Famers Karl Malone and John Stockton, who had built a contending team through years of excellence but who had never won a championship. The series went 6 games, the Jazz proving more difficult than some previous finals opponents, pushing the Bulls and making them earn the championship through close contests and fourth-quarter execution. Game 6 was played in Utah, the Jazz hoping to force a Game 7 by winning at home and extending the series. But the Bulls had other plans, executing down the stretch and pulling out a victory that clinched the championship on the road, denying Utah the chance to win at home and delivering the Bulls their 5th championship in 7 years. Jordan won his 5th Finals MVP award, continuing his perfect record in the finals, 5 championships, 5 Finals MVPs, cementing his legacy as not just the greatest player of his generation but perhaps the greatest player in basketball history. The 1997-98 season began with questions about whether the core could stay together, whether the chemistry and the success could continue for another year, whether the dynasty had one more championship run left before age and contract situations and personal tensions forced changes. Phil Jackson's contract was expiring and he wasn't certain he would return for another season, creating uncertainty about coaching continuity. Pippen was frustrated with his contract and his compensation relative to his contributions, creating tension that affected team chemistry at times. Rodman's off-court behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and distracting, raising questions about whether his on-court contributions were worth the chaos he brought. But despite the uncertainty and the tensions, the Bulls won 62 games during the regular season, proving they could still compete at elite levels even as the core aged and as the challenges mounted. The playoffs brought another march through the Eastern Conference, setting up a finals rematch with the Utah Jazz, who had won 62 games themselves and who believed that with home court advantage this time, they could finally break through and defeat the Bulls for the championship. The 1998 finals became one of the most memorable in NBA history, not just because of the games themselves, but because of the sense that this was the end, that regardless of the outcome, this Bulls team would be broken up, that Jordan and Jackson and perhaps others would be moving on after the season concluded. The series went back and forth, the Jazz winning at home, the Bulls winning in Chicago, the teams trading victories until it came down to Game 6 in Utah with the series tied at 3 games each. Game 6 on June 14, 1998, would become one of the most iconic games in basketball history, remembered not just by Bulls fans but by anyone who appreciates sports drama and individual greatness in crucial moments. The Jazz led by 3 points with less than a minute remaining, the home crowd anticipating a Game 7 back in Chicago, Utah's championship dream seemingly within reach. But Jordan scored to cut the lead to 1. Then on the next possession, he stole the ball from Karl Malone, creating a transition opportunity with the championship on the line. Jordan brought the ball up the court, the clock ticking down, the entire season coming down to 1 possession. He drove right, then crossed over to his left, creating just enough separation from defender Brian Russell. With 5.2 seconds remaining, Jordan rose up and released a jumper from the top of the key, the ball arcing through the air while millions watched, the outcome of the championship hanging on whether the shot would fall. The ball went through the net, nothing but the sound of the swish and the eruption of the Bulls bench celebrating, while the Utah crowd sat in stunned silence. Jordan's jumper over Brian Russell gave the Bulls an 87-86 lead with just seconds remaining. The Jazz had 1 final possession but couldn't score, and when the buzzer sounded, the Bulls were champions for the 6th time. Jordan had won his 6th Finals MVP, and the dynasty had completed its 2nd three-peat with one of the most dramatic endings in sports history. The shot over Brian Russell became iconic, replayed endlessly, the image of Jordan holding his follow-through while Russell fell to the floor becoming one of the most recognizable photographs in sports. It encapsulated everything about Jordan's greatness, the ability to perform in the biggest moments, the clutch gene that allowed him to deliver when everything was on the line, the competitive will that refused to accept defeat even when trailing with less than a minute remaining. The 6 championships came with a remarkable statistical quirk that demonstrated the Bulls' dominance in finals play. Chicago never played a Game 7 in any of their 6 finals victories. They won in 6 games against the Lakers in 1991, in 6 against Portland in 1992, in 6 against Phoenix in 1993, in 6 against Seattle in 1996, and in 6 games in both 1997 and 1998 against Utah. Never needing a 7th game meant the Bulls were always able to close out championships before being pushed to the absolute brink, that they could deliver the clinching victory in 6 games or fewer regardless of opponent or circumstances. The celebration after the 1998 championship was bittersweet, joy at the victory mixed with the knowledge that this was almost certainly the end. Phil Jackson had made it clear this was his final season coaching the Bulls, regardless of whether they won or lost. The organization was facing decisions about whether to rebuild around the aging core or to break it up and start fresh. And Michael Jordan, now 35 years old and having just completed his 2nd three-peat, retired again in January 1999 during the NBA lockout, walking away from basketball for the 2nd time and closing the dynasty that had dominated the NBA for nearly a decade. Jordan's 2nd retirement, announced during the labor dispute that had shut down the league, was expected this time in ways his first retirement hadn't been. He had accomplished everything possible: 6 championships, 6 finals MVPs, 5 regular season MVPs, 10 scoring titles, Defensive Player of the Year, All-Star MVPs, Olympic gold medals. There was nothing left to prove, no remaining challenges that could motivate him to continue playing. The competitive fire that had burned so intensely for so long had been satisfied by the 6 championships and by going out on top with the shot over Brian Russell, with another Finals MVP, with another championship that proved he was still the best when it mattered most. The dynasty was over, the greatest run in Bulls history concluded. The team that had won 6 championships in 8 years and that had completed 2 three-peats broken up as Jackson left, as Jordan retired, as the organization faced the inevitable rebuilding that follows every dynasty's end. From repeating as champions in 1997 and 1998 to Jordan's iconic jumper over Brian Russell, from never playing a Game 7 in 6 finals victories to the second retirement in 1999 that closed the dynasty, the second three-peat era brought ultimate triumph and perfect closure, the greatest player in basketball going out on top with the most dramatic shot imaginable, leaving behind a legacy of 6 championships and sustained excellence that would define the Chicago Bulls for generations. The end of the dynasty brought immediate and catastrophic collapse, the kind of organizational freefall that happens when a franchise built entirely around one generational talent suddenly loses that player and finds itself with an aging roster, no clear plan for rebuilding, and a fan base that had become accustomed to championships and that wouldn't accept mediocrity. Michael Jordan's retirement, Phil Jackson's departure, Scottie Pippen's trade to Houston, Dennis Rodman's release. The entire core that had won 6 championships was gone within months, leaving the Bulls with role players and aging veterans and nothing resembling the talent or the system that had produced sustained excellence. The 1998-99 season was shortened by a lockout that delayed the start and compressed the schedule to just 50 games, but even with the abbreviated season, the Bulls' struggles were obvious and painful. They finished 13-37, a winning percentage below .300, looking nothing like the team that had won 72 games and 6 championships just 2 years earlier. The losing was comprehensive and unrelenting. The Bulls overmatched most nights, unable to execute the triangle offense without the players who had made it work, unable to defend or compete with the intensity that had defined the dynasty years. But the 1998-99 season was just the beginning of the decline, a preview of how far the franchise would fall without Jordan and Jackson and the championship core. The 1999-2000 season brought rock bottom, a campaign so disastrous that it ranks among the worst in NBA history. The Bulls finished 13-69, winning just 13 games while losing 69, a winning percentage of .159 that was almost incomprehensible for a franchise that had been champions just 2 years earlier. 13 wins in an 82-game season meant losing 5 out of every 6 games, meant being non-competitive most nights, meant enduring blowout after blowout while fans who had celebrated championships just months earlier watched their team become the league's laughingstock. The Madhouse on Madison, which had been filled with deafening crowds during the championship years, now had thousands of empty seats. Fans unwilling to pay to watch a team that couldn't compete, that provided no entertainment value beyond the memories of what had been. The contrast between the packed arenas of the Jordan years and the half-empty building during the post-dynasty collapse was stark and depressing, a visual reminder of how far the franchise had fallen. The 5 seasons from 1999 through 2004 brought a total of just 95 wins combined, an average of fewer than 20 wins per season, sustained futility that tested the loyalty of even the most devoted Bulls fans. The organization tried to rebuild through the draft, using high lottery picks to select young players who might develop into stars, but the draft choices failed to produce the talent needed to return to competitiveness. In 2001, the Bulls selected Tyson Chandler and Eddie Curry with consecutive lottery picks, both high school players with enormous physical potential but with the raw skills and basketball understanding that required years of development. Chandler and Curry showed flashes of potential but never developed into the franchise cornerstones the Bulls had hoped for during their time in Chicago. Chandler was a defensive-minded center with length and athleticism, but lacked the offensive polish to be a go-to scorer. Curry had offensive skills and touch around the basket but was defensively limited and struggled with conditioning and consistency. Neither player could be the foundation for a winning team. Neither could deliver the kind of immediate impact that would lift the Bulls from the bottom of the standings, and the franchise remained mired in losing while waiting for the young players to develop. The coaching carousel continued during these years, the Bulls cycling through coaches who couldn't overcome the talent deficiency, who couldn't recreate even a fraction of what Phil Jackson had built, who were working with rosters that simply weren't good enough to compete in the NBA. The losing became routine, expected, numbing. Bulls games were opportunities for other teams to boost their statistics and their records, and Chicago became the opponent that struggling teams looked forward to facing because victory was almost guaranteed. But gradually, slowly, through continued drafting and player development, the Bulls began assembling young talent that would form the foundation for returning to respectability. In 2003, they drafted Kirk Hinrich, a point guard from Kansas who brought toughness and competitiveness and leadership that had been missing during the losing years. In 2004, they selected Luol Deng, a small forward from Duke who could score and defend and who brought the kind of professionalism and work ethic that championship teams require. They also drafted Ben Gordon that same year, a shooting guard who could score in bunches and who provided offensive firepower that made the Bulls more dangerous. The combination of Hinrich's leadership, Deng's two-way ability, and Gordon's scoring created a core that could compete, that could win games against quality opponents, that could restore some pride to a franchise that had been embarrassed for years. The improvement wasn't immediate. The 2004 to 2005 season still brought a losing record, but the trajectory was changing. The talent was accumulating, and the Bulls were beginning to look like a professional basketball team again rather than a collection of players just filling a roster. In 2007, the Bulls made the playoffs for the first time since Jordan's final championship in 1998, ending a 9-year postseason drought that had been the longest in franchise history. Their first-round opponent was the Miami Heat, the defending NBA champions who had won the title the previous year, led by Dwayne Wade and Shaq O'Neal. The Heat were heavily favored, expected to advance comfortably against a young Bulls team that was just happy to be in the playoffs after years of losing. But the Bulls shocked everyone by winning the series in a 4-game sweep, becoming just the 5th seed in NBA history to defeat a first seed in a playoff series. The sweep was stunning, improbable, a statement that the Bulls were back as a competitive franchise that could beat anyone on a given night. Kirk Hinrich played with the kind of toughness and determination that Jerry Sloan would have appreciated. Luol Deng scored efficiently and defended multiple positions, and Ben Gordon came off the bench to provide scoring bursts that kept Miami's defense off balance. The sweep of the defending champions was the Bulls' first playoff series victory since Jordan's final championship in 1998, ending a 9-year drought and proving that the dark years were finally over, that the franchise had successfully navigated the post-dynasty rebuilding and had returned to relevance. The victory was cathartic for Bulls fans who had endured the 13-69 season and the years of futility, who had remained loyal through the losing while waiting for the franchise to return to competitiveness. From winning just 95 games total over 5 seasons to the 13-69 disaster in 1999 to 2000, from failed draft picks like Chandler and Curry to the gradual accumulation of talent through Hinrich, Deng, and Gordon, from 9 years without a playoff appearance to the stunning sweep of the defending champion Heat in 2007, the post-dynasty years brought collapse and slow rebuilding, testing the franchise and its fans before finally delivering the playoff success that proved the Bulls could compete again. The championships were still distant, the franchise still searching for the next superstar who could lead them back to title contention, but respectability had been restored, competitiveness had returned, and the Bulls were once again a team worth watching and supporting. The 2008 NBA draft brought an opportunity that seemed almost too perfect, too storybook to be real. The Chicago Bulls, through a combination of their own struggles and a fortunate bounce in the draft lottery, earned the first overall pick in a draft class that featured a local hero, a player who had grown up in Chicago, who had starred at Simeon High School on the city's south side, who had led the University of Memphis to the national championship game as a freshman. Derrick Rose was his name, and he represented everything Bulls fans could hope for. Hometown kid returning to lead his city's team, explosive athleticism combined with court vision and leadership, the kind of talent that could potentially be a franchise cornerstone for the next decade. The Bulls selected Rose with the first overall pick, and the energy in Chicago immediately changed. This wasn't just another draft pick, another young player with potential. This was one of their own, a kid who had grown up rooting for the Bulls during the Jordan years, who understood what Chicago basketball meant, who carried the hopes and dreams of an entire city that was desperate to return to championship glory. Rose's signing press conference was emotional. The young point guard visibly moved by the opportunity to play for his hometown team, to represent the city where he'd learned to play basketball, to try to bring championships back to Chicago the way Jordan had done when Rose was a child. Rose's rookie season in 2008 to 2009 brought immediate impact and Rookie of the Year honors. He averaged over 16 points and 6 assists per game, running the offense with poise that seemed impossible for a 19-year-old, creating for teammates while also showing the explosive scoring ability that made him dangerous in pick-and-roll situations. The Bulls improved to 41 wins, still not playoff caliber but trending upward, building around their young point guard while adding complementary pieces through the draft and free agency. The progression over the next 2 seasons was remarkable. Rose developed rapidly, his scoring increasing, his decision-making improving, his confidence growing with each season. The Bulls added pieces around him. Joakim Noah providing interior defense and rebounding, Carlos Boozer bringing scoring and toughness at power forward, Luol Deng continuing to be a versatile two-way player. The combination created a team that could compete defensively, while Rose provided the offensive firepower necessary to win close games. The 2010-11 season brought everything together in ways that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The Bulls dominated the regular season, winning 62 games against just 20 losses, the best record in the entire NBA, proving they belonged among the league's elite teams. Rose was spectacular, averaging over 25 points and 7 assists per game, carrying the offensive load while making everyone around him better through his ability to penetrate and create, to score or pass depending on how defenses reacted, to deliver in clutch moments when games hung in the balance. At just 22 years old, Derrick Rose was named the NBA's most valuable player, becoming the youngest MVP in league history, surpassing previous record holders and establishing himself as not just a rising star but as the best player in basketball for that season. The MVP award was validation of everything Rose had accomplished, recognition that his combination of explosive athleticism, court vision, and clutch performance had elevated him to the very top of the sport. For Chicago fans, having a hometown kid win the MVP while leading the Bulls to the league's best record felt almost too good to be true, like the basketball gods were finally rewarding the city's loyalty after years of post-Jordan suffering. The 2011 playoffs brought legitimate championship hopes, the Bulls advancing through the first 2 rounds and reaching the Eastern Conference Finals where they would face the Miami Heat, a super team that had been assembled through free agency with LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh joining forces with championship aspirations. The series was hard-fought and competitive, Rose doing everything he could to carry the Bulls. But Miami's star power and experience proved too much, the Heat winning in 5 games and advancing to the finals while the Bulls went home disappointed but hopeful that with another year of development and perhaps some roster additions, they could break through and win the championship that seemed within reach. The 2011-12 season brought another strong regular season record despite a lockout-shortened schedule, the Bulls winning 50 games in just 66 games and earning the top seed in the Eastern Conference once again. Rose was again playing at an MVP level. The team's defense was elite, and everything pointed toward another deep playoff run with perhaps a different result against Miami or whoever emerged from the Eastern Conference gauntlet. But then came April 28, 2012, a date that would live in infamy for Bulls fans, a moment that would alter the franchise's trajectory, and that would rob Derrick Rose of what should have been the prime years of his career. The Bulls were playing the Philadelphia 76ers in Game 1 of the first round, leading comfortably late in the fourth quarter with the outcome no longer in doubt. Rose was still in the game when he drove to the basket, planted his left leg to jump, and immediately crumpled to the floor, grabbing his knee, his face contorted in pain that was obvious, even from a distance. The diagnosis was devastating. A torn ACL in his left knee, an injury that would require surgery and extensive rehabilitation that would cost him the entire following season, that would raise questions about whether he would ever return to the explosive, dynamic player he had been before the injury. ACLs are crucial for the kind of cutting and jumping and explosive movements that made Rose special, and modern sports medicine had improved outcomes for ACL injuries but couldn't guarantee that athletes would return to their previous levels, particularly athletes whose games were built on athleticism and quickness rather than on size and shooting. The injury in a game that was already decided, with Rose on the court when the outcome was no longer in question, made it even more painful. If Coach Tom Thibodeau had removed the starters earlier, if Rose had been resting on the bench protecting the lead rather than still playing, the injury might never have happened. The questions and the second-guessing were endless and ultimately pointless, but they lingered, creating tension and regret that compounded the devastation of losing the franchise's best player and the youngest MVP in history to a catastrophic injury. The Bulls' championship hopes, which had seemed so realistic just moments before Rose went down, evaporated instantly. Without their superstar point guard, without the player who made everything work offensively, the Bulls couldn't advance past Miami or whatever other elite teams they would face in the playoffs. They were competitive without Rose, their defense was still elite, but they lacked the offensive firepower and the clutch playmaking necessary to win championships, and the window that had seemed so wide open with the 23-year-old MVP suddenly felt like it might be closing before it had ever fully opened. From the storybook selection of the hometown kid with the first overall pick to Rose's immediate impact and Rookie of the Year award, from becoming the youngest MVP in history at 22 while leading the Bulls to 62 wins to the championship hopes of 2011 and 2012, from the devastating ACL tear that derailed everything, the Derrick Rose era brought soaring hopes and crushing heartbreak. The promise of championships and the reality of injury. The transformation of a franchise that seemed positioned for sustained excellence, only to have it all shattered in one terrible moment on a late April night in Chicago. The years following Derrick Rose's ACL injury were defined by hope and frustration in equal measure, the Bulls trying desperately to remain competitive, while their franchise player battled through rehabilitation and attempted comebacks that never quite restored him to his MVP form. Rose missed the entire 2012-13 season recovering from the ACL tear, the Bulls posting 50 wins without him but lacking the offensive firepower to advance deep into the playoffs. When Rose finally returned for the 2013-14 season, he showed flashes of his former brilliance, but also the hesitation and the caution that comes from fearing re-injury. The explosiveness diminished, the confidence in his body shaken by the knowledge of how quickly everything could be taken away again. More injuries followed, a torn meniscus in 2013, another meniscus injury in 2015, each setback further damaging Rose's ability to be the player he had been before that April night in 2012, each rehabilitation period creating more lost development time, more questions about whether he would ever recapture even a fraction of what had made him the youngest MVP in history. The Bulls remained competitive during these years, still making the playoffs, still winning games through defensive intensity and the development of other players, but the championship window that had seemed so wide open with a healthy 23-year-old Rose was closing, the opportunity slipping away season by season as injuries accumulated. But even as Rose's body betrayed him, even as the franchise player couldn't stay healthy enough to lead the team to the championships everyone had envisioned, another player was quietly developing, emerging from obscurity to become an all-star and eventual franchise cornerstone in ways nobody had predicted when he was drafted. Jimmy Butler had been selected with the 30th overall pick in the 2011 draft, the final selection of the first round, a player from Marquette University who hadn't been highly recruited out of high school, who had overcome difficult personal circumstances to even make it to college basketball, who carried a chip on his shoulder about being overlooked and underestimated. Butler's early years with the Bulls were spent as a role player, contributing on defense and playing limited minutes while the team was built around Rose and the other established veterans. But Butler worked obsessively on his game, spending extra hours in the gym developing his shooting and his ball handling, transforming himself from a defensive specialist into a two-way player who could score efficiently and create for himself and others. His work ethic became legendary within the organization, his commitment to improvement setting an example that coaches praised and that teammates either admired or resented depending on their own approach to the game. By the 2014-15 season, Butler had developed into an all-star, averaging over 20 points per game and earning recognition as one of the league's best two-way players, capable of defending the opponent's best perimeter player while also carrying significant offensive responsibilities. He won the Most Improved Player award, validation of the transformation from 30th pick to all-star, proof that draft position doesn't determine careers if players are willing to work and develop. Butler's emergence gave the Bulls hope that even with Rose's injury struggles, they could remain competitive with Butler as the primary offensive weapon. The mid-2010s Bulls posted multiple 50-win seasons despite the instability at the point guard position, and despite never quite having the roster depth necessary to compete with the NBA's true championship contenders. The 2014-15 season brought 50 wins, the team advancing to the second round of the playoffs before losing to the Cleveland Cavaliers and LeBron James. The competitiveness was real, the effort undeniable, but the results kept falling short of championship aspirations. The Bulls stuck in the middle tier of NBA teams, good enough to make the playoffs and win some series, but not talented enough or healthy enough to seriously threaten for titles. The coaching situation added to the instability. Tom Thibodeau, who had been hired in 2010 and who had built the Bulls into one of the league's premier defensive teams, had developed tensions with the front office over playing time management, over his tendency to play starters heavy minutes even in games that didn't require it, over philosophical differences about how to balance winning now versus preserving players' health for the long term. After the 2015 season, despite multiple playoff appearances and consistent regular season success, Thibodeau was fired, his departure creating another transition period for a franchise that had experienced too many transitions already. Fred Hoiberg was hired to replace Thibodeau, bringing a more modern offensive philosophy and a different approach to player management, but the results didn't improve despite the stylistic changes. The Bulls won 42 games in Hoiberg's first season, missing the playoffs for the first time since before Rose's MVP year, the decline sudden and disappointing for fans who had grown accustomed to at least making the postseason, even if championships remained elusive. And then, in June 2016, the Bulls made a decision that officially ended the Derrick Rose era and that signaled a commitment to rebuilding rather than trying to remain competitive with an aging and injury-compromised former MVP. They traded Rose to the New York Knicks, sending away the hometown kid who had brought so much hope and joy before the injuries had derailed everything, acknowledging that his body couldn't hold up to the demands of being a franchise player, that holding on to the past wouldn't help build the future. The trade was necessary but painful, closing a chapter that had promised championships but delivered only heartbreak and what-ifs. With Rose gone, the Bulls briefly tried to build around Jimmy Butler as the franchise cornerstone, pairing him with young players like Dwayne Wade, who returned to Chicago late in his career, and trying to remain competitive while also developing younger talent. But the approach was muddled, neither fully committing to winning now nor to rebuilding for the future, creating a team that was stuck in mediocrity without clear direction or identity. Butler himself grew frustrated with the situation, with the organization's indecision about whether to compete or rebuild, with younger players who he felt didn't match his work ethic and commitment. His complaints became public, creating tension within the locker room and with the front office, making it clear that the partnership between Butler and the Bulls wasn't sustainable long-term. In 2017, the Bulls traded Butler to the Minnesota Timberwolves, receiving young players and draft picks in return, officially committing to another rebuild after years of trying to remain competitive despite not having the roster talent to seriously contend for championships. From Butler's development from 30th pick to All-Star to his emergence as franchise cornerstone despite being overlooked in the draft, from multiple 50-win seasons that brought playoff appearances but limited success, from the frustrations of being good but not great to Rose's trade in 2016 that ended an era. From coaching changes and roster instability to Butler's eventual trade in 2017, the mid-2010s Bulls were defined by near misses and what might have beens, by competitiveness without championships, by the painful reality that Rose's injuries had closed a championship window before it had ever fully opened, and that the franchise needed to rebuild rather than continuing to chase relevance with rosters that couldn't deliver titles. The trade of Jimmy Butler in 2017 officially began another rebuilding phase, the Bulls committing to accumulating young talent and draft picks rather than trying to remain competitive with a flawed roster. The late 2010s brought the familiar pattern of losing seasons and high draft picks, the franchise searching for the next franchise player who could become what Derrick Rose had been before injuries derailed his career, what Michael Jordan had been during the dynasty years. The rebuilding was patient and deliberate, the organization resisting the temptation to rush back to competitiveness before the foundation was properly built. In 2017, the Bulls drafted Lauri Markkanen, a skilled 7-footer from Arizona, who could shoot from distance, and who represented the modern stretch big man that the NBA was increasingly valuing. The trade that sent Butler to Minnesota brought back Zach LaVine, a high-flying shooting guard who was recovering from his own ACL injury, but who had shown explosive scoring ability before the injury. LaVine arrived with questions about whether he could return to his pre-injury form, whether he could be more than just an athletic dunker, whether he had the all-around game necessary to be a franchise cornerstone rather than just a highlight reel performer. LaVine's development over the next few seasons answered some of those questions positively. He worked on his three-point shooting, becoming one of the league's most efficient long-range shooters, adding a skill that made him dangerous even when his explosiveness was limited by defensive attention. He improved his ball handling and playmaking, becoming capable of running pick and rolls and creating for teammates rather than just hunting his own shots. By the early 2020s, Levine had developed into a legitimate all-star, averaging over 25 points per game and earning recognition as one of the NBA's premier scorers. But individual scoring prowess doesn't translate to team success without complementary pieces and organizational direction, and the Bulls spent several years accumulating talent without finding the right combination of players and coaching that could produce sustained winning. They drafted Kobe White, Wendell Carter Jr., and Patrick Williams in consecutive drafts, adding young talent that showed potential but that needed development time. The wins remained elusive, the losing seasons continued, and the rebuild felt prolonged and uncertain, creating frustration among fans who had already endured the post-dynasty collapse and the post-Rose injury years, and who were tired of waiting for the Bulls to return to relevance. The turning point came in 2021 when the Bulls front office, led by executive Arturas Karnisovas, decided to accelerate the rebuild by trading for established veterans who could immediately make the team competitive. They acquired Nikola Vucevic, an all-star center from the Orlando Magic who brought scoring, rebounding, and veteran leadership. They signed DeMar DeRozan, a veteran wing who had been an all-star multiple times and who brought mid-range scoring mastery and playmaking ability that complemented Levine's three-point shooting. They added Lonzo Ball, a point guard whose defense and playmaking addressed needs that the roster had been missing. The 2021-22 season brought immediate improvement that surprised many observers who had expected the Bulls to remain in rebuilding mode. Chicago started the season winning games at rates they hadn't achieved in years, Levine and DeRozan forming a potent scoring duo, Vucevic providing interior scoring and rebounding, Ball running the offense and defending opposing point guards. The Bulls were competitive again, playing entertaining basketball, filling the United Center with enthusiastic crowds who were starved for winning after years of mediocrity. The season ended with a 46-36 record, a significant improvement over previous years and good enough to earn a playoff berth. But the playoff appearance came through the play-in tournament, the NBA's relatively new system where teams seeded 7th through 10th compete for the final playoff spots. The Bulls won their play-in game and advanced to the actual playoffs, where they faced the Milwaukee Bucks, the defending NBA champions led by Giannis Antetokounmpo. The series was competitive initially, but Milwaukee's championship pedigree and superior talent proved too much. The Bucks winning in 5 games and exposing the gap between the Bulls' return to competitiveness and actual championship contention. The 2022-23 season brought regression and frustration. Lonzo Ball suffered a knee injury that would keep him out for the entire season and beyond, robbing the Bulls of their starting point guard and defensive anchor. The team struggled with consistency, winning some games against quality opponents but losing others they should have won, finishing 40-42 and again needing the play-in tournament to reach the playoffs. They won their first play-in game but lost the second, failing to advance to the actual playoffs, the season ending in disappointment and creating questions about whether this core could ever break through to genuine contention. The 2023-24 season brought more of the same, solid regular season play that hovered around .500, occasional stretches of competitiveness mixed with frustrating losing streaks, another finish that required the play-in tournament. The Bulls won their play-in game again, earning the right to face the Boston Celtics in the first round of the playoffs, but were thoroughly outmatched, losing quickly and again demonstrating that making the playoffs and competing for championships are vastly different achievements. The 2024-25 season continued the pattern, the Bulls finishing with a record near .500, reaching the play-in tournament for the 4th consecutive year, but again failing to advance beyond that preliminary round, the season ending without even making the actual playoff bracket. The consistency of reaching the play-in tournament 4 straight years demonstrated a certain level of competitiveness, proved the Bulls weren't rebuilding anymore, showed they could compete with the NBA's middle-tier teams. But it also revealed their ceiling. They were stuck in the middle. Not bad enough to get high draft picks that could bring transformative talent, not good enough to seriously threaten the league's elite teams, hovering around .500 year after year without clear direction or path to improvement. The core of Levine, Vucevic, and DeRozan produced entertaining basketball and regular season competitiveness, but couldn't deliver playoff success or championship contention. Levine's scoring was impressive but sometimes inefficient in crucial games. Vucevic provided steady production but was limited defensively against elite opponents. DeRozan brought mid-range mastery but was aging and lacked the three-point shooting that modern offenses increasingly require. The combination worked well enough to win 40-something games per season, but not well enough to advance deep into the playoffs or to challenge the Celtics, Bucks, and other Eastern Conference powers. As the mid-2020s approached, the Bulls found themselves searching for their next defining era, stuck in a familiar middle ground that has plagued the franchise for much of the post-Jordan period. They were competitive enough to make the play-in tournament year after year, but not talented enough to break through to genuine contention. The question facing the organization was whether to continue building around the current core, hoping that development and roster additions could push them over the top, or whether to accept that this group had reached its ceiling and to begin another rebuild in pursuit of the franchise-altering talent necessary to return the Bulls to championship glory. From rebuilding around Levine to adding Vucevic and DeRozan in 2021, from reaching the play-in tournament 4 consecutive years from 2022 through 2025 to failing to advance beyond that preliminary round, from hovering around .500 without clear direction to searching for the next defining era that could restore championship basketball to Chicago. The modern Bulls represent competitiveness without excellence, relevance without dominance, a franchise still searching for the combination of talent and coaching and organizational vision that could return them to the heights they reached during the Jordan Dynasty years that now feel increasingly distant with each passing season of middle-tier mediocrity.